Joining us to talk about this is Angelo Carusone. He is the CEO, president of Media Matters. They essentially watch a lot of right-wing media, so the rest of us don't have to. Angelo is also an expert on right-wing, not only extremism, but also how they use media. Angelo, first of all, thanks for being with us. What's your reaction to the Facebook decision?
I mean, it's sort of, this was a sort of boop in Facebook's face a little bit, because this whole oversight board was designed as an organ for them to sort of shirk responsibility and not have to make these decisions. And so they kind of gave it to the oversight board to deal with, and they punted it right back to Facebook. So my immediate reaction was, this was a PR issue run amok. And my second is that unless they ban him immediately, we're basically going to be in the exact same place 6 months from now.
And the Facebook Oversight Board said that they were a little bit concerned about a sort of an indefinite suspension that they said was vague and uncertain because of the rules of Facebook. So they've given Facebook 6 months to try to come up with some protocols and to figure out exactly how Trump's punishment fits into their protocols. So what do you see Facebook doing over the next 6 months?
I think it really depends on what we do, what all of us do, because I think ultimately what they're trying, what they would like to do is run out the clock and let Trump back on. And the reason being is that he does have a huge social media presence, right? And his ability to drive engagement that gets them increased, traction and attention spent there. But worse, if he's back on Facebook and he's not anywhere else, it gives them a bit of a competitive advantage, because that'll roll us right into the midterms, and then everyone will have to cover Trump's latest Facebook statements, and especially as he weighs into primary fights. So I think they would like him to come back. But it's an open question. I think there's a lot of grounds for them to, make the ban immediate. We tracked several hundred individual posts from Trump from just 2020 alone that explicitly break Facebook's terms of service as they relate to election misinformation and public health misinformation. So it's not like they don't have plenty of cause to do it. And there is a precedent. They would have to follow the Alex Jones model for a permanent ban. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for them. The same thing took place with Alex Jones.
And there have been other social media platforms, Twitter, for example, who have also said, look, Donald Trump violated our terms of service and we're just banning him. That's not even a question for us. Is the issue, you think, driven by money in this case because of the hundreds of millions of dollars that Donald Trump essentially spent on Facebook ads and, of course, the amount of traction he's able to generate?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you said it in the context of ads, because that's the one thing that when people talk about the fact that Trump was somehow giving them money, the reality is last quarter their profits were up. So his presence alone isn't, they found a way to monetize hate without Donald Trump. So that's been the case, but he was one of their biggest ad spenders in 2020. Just a ton of money. And part of his ability to stay politically relevant would rely on that constant churn, spending more money on Facebook so that you can get a couple cents back on the dollar. And it's basically it's a massive grift. So that's a piece of it. I think the other part is that their audience really likes what Trump gives them. That's reflected in, every day, the top 10 posts are consistently from far right sources and things that sound an awful lot like Donald Trump. So they don't want to alienate their audience. And the third is we have to think about this in a global context, because they're dealing with this exception around a leader is how they're describing it. And that means whatever they do here would set some sort of a precedent for how they would deal with extremists internationally. And the reality is there's a lot of Trump-like figures using the platform all across the board. But the thing is, not a single person on at least public official or major account on Facebook has broken the rules as consistently and as frequently as Donald Trump did in 2020.
You mentioned that you monitor, Media Matters monitors of Facebook and a lot of right-wing posts. What is it about that organization? And I'm sure that we've all seen it sort of evolve over the last couple of years, but what is it that has made them, as opposed to other social media organizations, more friendly or more welcoming to right-wing extremists in various groups, whether it's Donald Trump driven or driven by other groups?
In this case, it's personnel. I think that's one of the really big factors. And oftentimes people focus on Peter Thiel, who's a board member and sort of served as a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg, and he's kind of like this right-wing media figure. But actually, the real thing that made them more right-leaning is a guy by the name of Joel Kaplan, who sets all of the policy, all the rules for Facebook, and all of the major moments over the past few years that have ultimately tilted in favor of the right were policies that he set. And Joel Kaplan was George W. Bush's former deputy chief of staff. And he was a participant in the Brooks Brothers riots in the year 2000, that Republican operation to shut down vote counting during the recount in Florida. his deputy is also a Republican operative that was a participant at the Brooks Brothers riots. And those two people are really the ones sort of setting the terms. There's a lot of other factors, but ultimately they're the ones that are making most of these calls. And over time, that has largely helped create the conditions where it's favored the right and disadvantaged basically everybody else.
Regarding Donald Trump, and again, you mentioned the number of posts that had misleading posts, outright lies. Just recently, Donald Trump there was putting out a press release, which was again saying that anybody who doesn't talk about the election being stolen is in fact lying. So again, he just continues with this nonsense. Does this neuter him though to a certain extent, at least for the next 6 months, because he doesn't have Facebook, he doesn't have any other social media platform. He still has to rely on press releases to spew out whatever nonsense he wants to spew out.
You're exactly right. It does. It does limit his ability to get his message out. It makes him dependent on others. It makes him dependent on sort of the Rush Limbaugh like ditto heads who will amplify what he says, and it makes him dependent on the rest of the media to pick up those press releases and inject them into social media and in their news coverage. And certainly it means he can't directly influence a lot of primaries by helping with fundraising, at least online, and also by helping drive people to candidates' websites. So it's going to have an effect on minimizing him over the next 6 months and give other people a chance to sort of fill the space. So there is that. But I think if Facebook really didn't want Trump back on, which I think that's why they're trying to wait and see. The reality is what they would have turned right around today and said is, okay, our ban is immediate, just like Twitter did, but they didn't do that. And that's the suspect action here is why wait? There's no need to.
Media Matters has been around longer than Facebook, longer than Twitter. Back in the day, you would monitor what Fox News and other conservative media organizations were sort of putting out there to try to make sure that they were trying to be honest to the extent that they could. Now it seems like the number of conservative media outlets has intensified and has spread. I wonder if you can put in some context the role of a Facebook and how much perhaps that supplants the role that cable news used to carry for conservative media.
Yeah, if you wanted to make sure that everybody if you wanted to saturate the conversation, 10 years ago, it would have been talk radio and cable news. That would have basically get you all the people you needed to reach. And even if you didn't get them directly, the people that did consume it would spread your message for you through word of mouth. You got everybody. That's not the case now. In fact, almost all of the Facebook is the ball game. And the majority of what you're seeing on Facebook is saturating well before it hits cable news. It's already sort of far outlasted anything else. I'll give one example to point that out. Steve Bannon had a radio show in the fall, a sort of a podcast program type thing, and he had 3 million listeners entirely through Facebook and YouTube live streams. Never once touched a traditional media outlet. When YouTube banned him in January, he lost 70% of his audience. 3 million was more than was watching CNN on their best days in October. And that's just one small piece to your point of this larger constellation of right-wing outlets.
So for people who are not so familiar with social media, maybe of a certain generation or people who don't like it, I mean, whether we like it or not, I mean, Facebook, Twitter, social media is essentially the biggest game in town right now. And so these decisions, I guess my point is that these decisions by Facebook, not only do they matter, but they also have far-reaching consequences in terms of our society and our politics.
They are, and one of the good things about Trump being pushed off, aside from him not being able to do it, is there was one bright spot that I saw. Is that there's still a bunch of people there, right? And conservatives and right wingers, even though they don't trust the media, they largely still trust their local news. That hasn't really been hurt very much. When Trump was removed from Facebook, one of the effects that we saw in tracking it is a lot of local news individually started to get more engagement and more reach on Facebook's platform because there's a whole bunch of users there that needed something, and the algorithm started to feed them content from sources that they would engage with. And it's an example of how Facebook can be a determining of fates, not just around individual narratives, but even around what used to be, the pillars of the information landscape, which is local news.
Angela, you mentioned it just a minute ago, but again, 6 months from now, we'll be sort of right back, I suppose, waiting to see what Facebook does. For people who want to try to make a difference, what can all of us do in terms of whether it's lobbying or making our voices heard to somehow try to influence this Facebook decision that will come again in 6 months?
I think the simplest thing is to make sure that everybody knows that it's temporary and not let that fall out of the wayside, to keep complaining, delete Facebook, participate in some of the blackouts. And we made it pretty easy. We've built a tool, bantrumpnow.com. It's not a subscription thing. You don't have to sign up. It just has all of the posts that break the rules. You go 30 seconds, you report them, let them know that they don't have to wait anymore. Just get it over with. Everybody's making the calls, do it fast.
Angelo Carusone, he's the president and CEO of Media Matters. Traditionally, they've been the group that watches the right-wing media, so the rest of us don't have to. But now they're watching not only cable news, they're also watching social media, Twitter, Facebook. Angelo, thanks so much for coming on. I suppose we'll be talking with you again in another 6 months when this comes up again, but we do appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. We really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.